But I'm imagining myself if my experience of the Eastern churches were very minimal and I came here and listened to you, after this half hour, I would know some valuable things. So I thank you for that. I was going to ask you, but you at least began to answer it in your last 5 minutes or so, the question that you asked yourself. If all of this is so, what's gumming up the works? And why is there not the union that everyone desires? But I think you touched upon that. So I will turn over the questions to my fellow panelists.
Mr. D'Antonio, thank you for your presentation. Could you say again why or in what sense the definition of schism given by Ignatius and Pope Pelagius is more fundamental? You sort of said several times it points to a more fundamental sense of schism than the definition given in the Code of Canon Law.
Yeah.
This maps onto like de jure, de facto, but what's the argument for it being more fundamental?
Yeah, I guess the way that my argument for that is that I think back to the usage of that word and that fact that throughout time, it seems that, or throughout the first millennium of the church, the use of the word schism was used in that manner and in that way. And I guess I kind of alluded to this, but maybe I should be more clear that it seems like when you have the schism in which, the word schism was being used in a certain sense, but now that there's kind of a lack of clarity in what it means, it kind of seemed to necessarily the Roman Catholic Church turned to using the criteria being the papacy, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that was the more common use of the word and the way that the church had used it. And once when matters got difficult, seems that they kind of turned to this sort of canonical definition. And also the canonical definition is kind of a reduction of the thought, right? It's a law. That is what canon law is. And when you look to
like in the sense of a boiling down, or a reduction like a decline?
A boiling down,
okay.
Right? When you look to the Eastern Catholic canon law, it's very fascinating because the way they describe it is that schism is separate or refusing the authority of the church rather than the papacy, right? So what I'm pointing to is that the way that the whole church used schism referred to kind of more in the general sense of the church, while the West started to talk about it more purely in terms of the papacy.
Can I just not wrest the conch from you, but just ask a clarifying question? And then
Take the conch.
Then let you go on. When the Roman Church turned to this due to the difficulties you outlined, was that turning an invention of man, like a convenient way out of a difficulty, or was it a discernment of something, of some kind of truth? Did that distinction make sense?
Yes. When they turn to this definition, are they turning to the way that the church works, or if it actually speaks to some sort of reality in the church?
Yeah. Are they stating something true about the way Christ founded his church, or are they inventing a legalistic phrase for themselves that helps them but doesn't help anybody else?
I think it's helpful insofar as for especially Rome to know who is in union with them. And I think that there's a certain amount of truth behind saying, putting the papacy as the criteria, but I don't think that we can look simply at that. As the criteria. It seems like there are other things that the church considered when talking about schism, besides just the papacy.
No, and I should just state for full clarity, I agree with that.
Okay.
Something similar to, if I go back to the question about the reduction, when you boil something down, the goo left in the bottom of the pan was there already, just distributed through more liquid.
Yeah.
Right. And so when the Roman Church boils it down and ends up with this goo, was the submission to the Roman pontiff something they put in the pot, or was it there already and it's left after they boiled it a long time?
That's a good analogy.
You came up with
And I just
Yeah.
say, and I'm completely agreeing
Yeah.
that schism in its original fundamental sense was the constituted version with all the liquid in it, and that this is a boiling down. I'm just asking about when they boil down, do they introduce a foreign element, or do they just sort of, does the evaporation of the water expose something that had been there somehow but not noticed?
It seems like that was there before, but that it was kind of considered in the context of the whole of the apostolic sees and of the whole entire patriarchy.
Okay, and
Right, like
absolutely,
yeah.
You answered my question.
Oh,
thank you.
I have the contradiction. just to maybe close this line of questioning. Ought the Roman Code of Canon Law be revised, corrected, in order to more fully capture or recapture or make explicit the intrinsic aspect that you were pointing to?
Yeah.
In other words, do you see this as actually there has been a loss in the reduction?
I think in the way there has that, I think, as I've been kind of alluding or saying, there's two different ways it seems to think about schism, where you have the schism between two churches, and then you have the active schism with the whole entire universal church, right? If that makes sense. Another way to put it is, we say that the East is in schism with the West, but I would say they're in schism with each other.
But that
helps
that
at
is
all.
not captured by the definition of canon law, right?
Yes.
That- And
that's what I'm saying.
in that respect, it's deficient.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. We've hit on a few of the things that I wanted to ask about. And actually, just at the last point, Joey, you in the way you answered his question, you answered the question I was about to ask you, which is a helpful clarification on what you're saying, that there's no way to simply bring the Orthodox Church to the table with the West and have a conversation. But there's the Orthodox churches, and I'm reading an account right now of the relationships between the United States and the Native Americans of Wyoming in the 1860s, and they're continually running across the fact that you get Chief so-and-so to agree to something on behalf of the Lakota. But Chief so-and-so doesn't agree, and all of a sudden you're like, and the United States vision of how the tribes work is just not up to the situation. So I'm going to ask a tricky question. This document, Uniotism, Method of Union of the Past and the Present Search for Full Communion, who authors, who made the document?
Yeah. Sorry if I wasn't clear about that. That was made by both an agreement between the Catholic legates and the Orthodox legates at the meeting. Whoever was sent by the church to have that discussion.
Yeah. Does that document just sort of come out of the meeting and the legates approve it and that's the end, or does it go back to their respective churches for further vetting and approval by someone else? I guess I'm curious about the status of the document. Like, is this a document of the church, of the Western Church's magisterium? Is this a statement from the Eastern Church's, pontiffs, or is this a document issued by some smart and interesting people who got together?
Well, I mean, as ambassadors of the two churches, they wrote this in agreement with each other, right? So I see where you're asking the question. Oh, was this like signed off on approval after written by like the hierarchy of whoever they would go to?
I guess to put in technical speak, I'm seeking the authority level of the document. You know,
Yeah.
That is, if I whip this out on a friend, he's reasonably going to ask me to what degree this document is binding on him. And there are documents that come out with Vatican letterhead, and they have no binding power because they don't have anything to do with the magisterium. And then there are other documents that are somewhere in between. And there are other documents that have tremendous binding power. You know, so where are we?
Yeah. No, the point of me bringing this up, I suppose, is to point to how the church is talking about the Orthodox churches. So in that way, it's not binding, right? It's not ex cathedra, right? But I still think something that's important, the way that we think about them.
Yeah.
So I'm not exactly sure who, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure about who, like what exactly the level that would fall on is, because it's something that seems rather unusual.
Yeah.
But
yeah. One more question. Well, okay. 2 more questions for me. Sorry. Here's maybe the easier question. When I entered the Roman Catholic Church, there was a liturgical ceremony, but I was not rebaptized. And although my parents' marriage was blessed, it was not considered to be that the sacrament was then that they then gained the sacrament of marriage. We were existing outside the church most of my childhood with sacraments. Does that mean that we were part of the church? I have apparently had the indwelling of the Trinity, and my parents apparently had the sacrament of marriage. Where does that put us in relationship to being a part of the church?
Yeah. Lumen Gentium kind of talks about this, where it points to the worship by other denominations and even Islam, and how they have a certain participation in the church. And I would say to a certain extent, like you do participate in the church by having received the baptism. But the point I want to make with that is the fact that there's no formal liturgical service, there's no act of the church that brings an Orthodox into the church, into Catholicism, which has the implications of that I had pointed out.
Okay, so we've got gradations. You were just suggesting the Muslims are over there in some way participating. I presume, I hope that you were saying that as a Protestant child, I was a little closer than the Muslims with my Trinitarian baptism. But still outside the church, because there's this formal ceremony we need, and then we get the situation all the way up to there's no ceremony needed. With the case of one of the Orthodox churches. So when we get to that last point, can you give me a metaphor for the situation? It seems like as a Protestant child, you could say, someone took the skizzers and schismed me right off. And I was over there with, had some cloth. That was good, but not on the garment in any way, but it seems like what you're arguing is that the scissors and cloth metaphor is not helpful for the situation of the Orthodox Church. Is there another image that better captures the situation? Schism is in a way a metaphor, right? It's being cut off imagines a kind of whole like a cloth, and very often, of course, the seamless garment of Christ is invoked in these conversations as the church is supposed to be like Christ's garment that couldn't be divided among the soldiers because it was, woven seamlessly through. So there's this metaphor of the cloth and the scissors, but you're saying, no, much closer than that. And yet you also seem to be saying, but there's still something.
Mm-hmm.
There's still something between somethings. Is there a metaphor that you think would be helpful for describing the situation between the West and the various Eastern churches?
Yeah, I think I forgot which gospel it is, but how Christ talks about how, I think this is helpful. Talks about how, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, that kind of thing. And I think that you could almost say it's a kind of a similar situation as, like, obviously it's a different way in which we're looking at what Christ is laying out. But insofar as, like, the East and the West are part of the body, but still separate and not interacting in a certain sense of them. But they're still connected, right?
Mm.
I don't know if that's helpful, but
I'll give it some thought.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Shall we open it up?
But do you choose or I choose?
We shall open it up.
Joe?
Thank you, Joey, so much for your preparation.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned using Father Anderson as an example, how a Eastern Orthodox came to the Western Church just by professing or signing a document of the Nicene Creed. I was wondering if you could speak more.
Not quite accurate, John.
Okay,
I did not enter the Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
got it.
I entered the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church.
Right. So,
The two are distinct.
sorry.
The two are distinct. They are particular churches. Yes.
So, but like the only thing that had to be done was signing a document on the Nicene Creed, right?
Mhm.
Or is that correct?
That's right.
So, I wish, could you speak more to that, why it was necessarily the Nicene Creed and not something else, or, yeah.
Yeah, so the creed, specifically the Nicene Creed. You're asking about whether the Nicene Creed or like any other creed or
Yeah,
some other sort of
I guess
document.
why it was that the thing to be done?
Mhm.
Why specifically the Nicene Creed and like nothing else, like not redoing any of the sacraments, the Nicene Creed itself?
Yeah.
Or maybe some pledge of allegiance to the one can imagine things, right?
Yeah.
No.
I mean, when you look to my knowledge, every liturgical service, you say the Nicene Creed before you receive communion, before you have the Eucharistic sacrifice. So by saying, oh, we're entering into communion with you, or you're asking for communion with them, you're professing the same thing as them, right? Yeah. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah.
Just like a very brief follow-up. Did you at all in your research look into the St. Thomas Christians of Kerala in India?
I've not looked into them now.
They're just a very interesting case because they were converted apparently by St. Thomas
Mhm.
And the apostle, and when they came into contact with the Portuguese, some of them came into communion with the Roman Catholic Church, some of them came into communion with the Eastern
Mhm.
Orthodox, some of them remained not in communion with either. I don't know what the process for that was with the Portuguese in the 17th, 16th century, but
No, not to
that
my
might be an
knowledge.
interesting extension of this.
For sure. Mr. Danton, is it?
So the last 5 minutes of your discussion kind of answered what I was thinking I was going to ask you about. And the discussion over here at the table also is answering things I would have asked you about. But the study of church history, you have that fixed date that Father David alluded to was like, okay, yesterday, yes, today, no. It's certainly not, but we have to fix a point into it. In further study of church history, you'll see periods of time where there was reunification. for maybe a lifetime of a person, but didn't stick. Okay, what do you think the Eastern Rite churches, Catholic churches, did to come over that the Orthodox Church is not getting to?
What did they?
What the Eastern Rite churches reunified, came back with the Latin Rite under the Pope. There was something that allowed them to do that that's lacking in the Orthodox Church doing. What do you think that missing element is?
Well, that would have been for them to ask for communion from the Pope of Rome at the expense of leaving communion with their mother church. I mean, that's essentially what they had to do, and in so doing, there's a lot of theologians that comment upon how they lost a lot of their character as an Eastern church because they were kind of absorbed rather than united in a certain way. And that's what the church. That's the point of the Orthodox Catholic dialogue, is pointing to that we should no longer be absorbing the churches into the Roman Church, but something that they should remain distinct upon communion. If that makes sense. Does that answer your question? Or?
So, in the Latin Church, the SSPX, right? They've got that going on, but then you have the FFSP guys who are saying we don't want to be separated from the Holy Father, and they included the name Peter in their title. Something brought them back. The Eastern Rite churches, was it individual patriarchs, and deciding they wanted to, or
that would have been
easier for an individual patriarch to agree, right?
Yeah.
Versus what you spoke about the last 5 minutes was you got this gang of people who can't settle amongst themselves, much less with the other side. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Is that what you would say is an individual patriarch was able to bring?
Yeah, for the most part,
Ukrainian or whatever.
It's the patriarchs and the bishops that are making the act of communion rather than the more common congregation, like people of the church, because they follow their bishop.
If I could insert,
Yes, please.
in the Eastern Catholic churches, for the most part, were portions of Orthodox churches that entered into communion with the Roman Catholic Church through a series of unions. So there's not one, but several. In the case of the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, as it's officially called, it took place in 1596, the Union of Brest, it's called, and all but it's either 3 or 5. I don't know why I can't remember the number, but 3 rings a bell. Bishops. Of course, there wasn't any Ukraine or Ukrainian church in the 16th century. They were called Ruthenians, which is simply a Latinization of Rossini, the Rus. And they agreed to a very reasonable, there was a good bit of give and take in the document, that they would maintain their tradition as they had received it, that their entering into communion with the Church of Rome did not mean taking upon themselves distinctly Latin practices and so forth, but simply was indeed the acknowledgement of the Pope of Rome as exercising the Petrine ministry in the unique way that is claimed for him. But it was a choice for them at that time. They had 3 choices: Moscow, Constantinople, or Rome, because they had been cut off because of the Mongol invasions for 4 centuries. They chose Rome because they gravitated toward Western Europe, and also because they desired this focus of unity in the church, which they experienced what happens when that is lacking.
Joe, you keep on raising up your hand.
Joey, thank you very much. Though I am a proud Roman, you see me almost every Sunday at the Divine Liturgy. I love the East. Permit me to play devil's advocate for a moment. Earlier you were saying that or implying that, you know, there were faults on both sides, right, for why we haven't reunified yet. You've also said that one of the remaining sticking points is to better understand the papacy. And a third thing that you've said is a lot of it is mostly practical. There's not really a lot of doctrinal differences. I'd like to kind of poke a little bit at that. Blessed Pio Nono, right, Pius IX, right, issues the syllabus of errors. And one of the things that he puts in there, I can't remember verbatim how he says it, but essentially is a claim to be condemned as the Roman pontiff contributed to the Eastern schisms. And he says, no, that can't be held, right? The Pope is free from any kind of culpability on this point. But more so than the syllabus of errors, you have the Vatican Council, you know, essentially saying something very strong about the papacy that I think the Orthodox are wary of understanding the Pope that way. That doesn't seem practical. That seems doctrinal. Could you speak to, like, how are we, you know, with a love for the East and a love for the Roman Catholic Church, supposed to recognize or reconcile those kind of doctrinal things? Are we supposed to say, well, Pio Nono was holy, but he was just wrong on this point with the syllabus of the errors, and maybe a further clarification at a future ecumenical council could resolve this, or is there something else going on? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
So you're saying Pope Pius IX said that the papacy was in no way at fault for the schism, and then, but that seems like to be a doctrinal issue because he stated that that was the case, or yeah, I'm sorry.
Meaning the syllabus of errors isn't typically taken as a kind of disciplinary thing that says, for now, we're going to treat it as if the Romans pontiff, you know, wasn't at fault. But, you know, in the future, if future evidence comes up, you know, we could say, whoops, whoopsie, right, you know, we messed up. It seems that the syllabus of errors is designed in such a way that it's intending to communicate perennial truths. We could say, like, well, you know, maybe, right, you know, it could be wrong because it wasn't an ex cathedra kind of thing, right? And maybe there's a way to reconcile the First Vatican Council's teaching on the papacy with something else, right, that would be amenable, the Orthodox would be amenable to. But I guess I'm just trying to, how do we respect, right, those kind of things that seem more doctrinal, or maybe they are actually, in fact, disciplinary. And you see what I'm saying, the difficulty that, you know, somebody in my case has where I love both.
Yeah, like, I mean, something to consider within that is that, I think a lot of the schism was due primarily to miscommunication and differences in languages and distance, right? They were oceans apart from each other, you know, and I mean, to say that the papacy was not at fault, I mean, I think that, like, in a direct way, you could kind of say that that's true, but also a lot of what he did was kind of like what sparked the East to, like, really like split, you know, and a lot of the, you know, events that followed afterwards, especially things like putting Roman bishops in like the Eastern cities, right? Like, of course, that's gonna make them mad and like feel like that's a sort of aggression. Or, I mean, this isn't the Pope's fault, but you know, when the Crusaders raided Constantinople, which is a huge thing that the East still sticks to and is angry about. So, I mean, I guess, like, yeah, in not an exactly a direct way that's true, but there's a, right, by acting in a certain way, that's you should expect that the other side is going to react in a certain way as well, right?
So I take you to be saying, like, further nuancing is necessary, that in fact there really isn't. It's still a practical issue of separation, not a doctrinal one. We just have to be a lot more precise with our language about, like, what constitutes fault, or is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely a lot of clarification is needed in, like I said, the functioning of the papacy, how he's supposed to interact with the East. So
Pope Benedict, blessed memory, said just that. He addressed the patriarchs of the Orthodox churches not presently in communion with the Catholic Church and said, please help me redefine the exercise of my office. Not please redefine my office for me, but please help me redefine the exercise of my office. Every word is important.
Unfinished Vatican I.
Well, yes, and perhaps unfinished Vatican II, too. Forgive me for intervening.
We're about at an hour.
Oh.
Maybe you can take another question.
Or, yeah.
Okay, Nate.
Just sort of a practical question, like relating to that, and what Father David just said. It's sort of a fun card to pull out as a Roman Catholic. Be like, well, you're not under, under the Pope. We have the Pope. You are, under him. Should this mindset sort of be like done away with, like this idea that like, oh, we're under the Pope, so we're in the right, in order to like reunite the churches? Because like a lot of people in like Romans sort of think about that. And should we more think about it in order to bring the union about, instead of like this idea of the East needs to be subjected to the Pope and subjected to Rome? It needs to be more of this idea of reunion of churches, looking towards the magisterium more as the head. Like, I don't know, like what's the use? Like, who should we look to as the head of the church in order to better reunite the churches? I don't know, something.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot back to the Gospels, right, or in the Acts of the Apostles, right? Like, how did Peter function amongst the apostles, right? And there's an elevated status to Peter, certainly, compared to the other apostles, but there's also an equality with them, in a certain like manner that he has final judgment. He that's if they're arguing, they go to Peter, right? I think that's a good way to think about it, is the way that it is functioning is, on the one hand, like he's there as kind of I almost want to say a last resort, like a last say, for the church to be able to unify them when they're arguing, unify them when there's dissension in dogma and stuff. I don't know if that kind of helps, but
Yeah, I guess just like, so is it not a very good mindset to be like, oh, like I'm under the Pope, I'm in the good? Is that like not a really healthy mindset to reunite the churches? Should it be more like trying to look at the magisterium and tradition of the church?
yeah,
instead?
I would say as a Roman, it is good to think that way. As an Easterner, it's important to think that, to consider that the Eastern Orthodox churches are the mother church of the Eastern Catholic churches, and to consider in that way as well, that's where your tradition is held as an Eastern Catholic, is in the tradition of the Eastern Orthodox, and primarily. So.
Thank you, Joseph.